I'm a refugee of sorts from the American civil rights movement in the 1960s. And while things certainly became better in the United States in terms of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and class discrimination, after many years of working in the American civil rights movement, I came to the conclusion that the movement had actually failed. It failed in the sense of making gender and class and ethnicity and race irrelevant. They still play a major role in the life outcomes of individuals. And so to think about, in order to propose more efficacious means of equalizing opportunity and eliminating discrimination, I decided it really was necessary to try to understand the dynamics of discrimination better than we had, and try to understand why our efforts at eliminating discrimination had failed. And in doing this, I developed this model called social dominance theory. And social dominance theory really starts out with the observation that human social systems tend to be structured as group-based hierarchies, with dominant groups at the top of the social systems and subordinate groups at the bottom. And there are major differences in the degree of hierarchical organization from one society to another, and the degree of group-based hierarchy within societies over time. But there is no exception we've come up with of the society not being organized as a group-based hierarchy. And in thinking about this, we made two basic assumptions about these group-based hierarchies. The first one is, since human social systems seem to be hierarchical regardless of time, place, culture, or economics, we came to the conclusion, or made the assumption, that human social systems were predisposed to organize themselves in a hierarchical manner. The second assumption is that in order to understand the dynamics of racism and sexism and classism and nationalism and many other kinds of social oppression, it was really necessary to understand the dynamics of hierarchical social formation in the first place. And that you can think of these various forms of oppression, like racism and slavery and sexism, as simply instantiations, special instantiations of the general tendency for societies to organize themselves in a hierarchical manner. In thinking about the dynamics of group-based hierarchy, we made the observation that human social systems are hierarchically organized along three different dimensions. The first one is in the basis of age, and this is a non-controversial observation that adults tend to have more power and social decision-making opportunities than minors. This is not a particularly controversial observation. The second one, however, is slightly more controversial, and this is the observation that all societies, without exception, and regardless of time period, tend to be organized along gendered dimensions. That is to say, societies tend to be patriarchal in their social organization, with dominant groups dominated by men and dominating women. The third form of hierarchical organization is what we call arbitrary set. These are distinctions between in-groups and out-groups on the basis of race or class or ethnicity or religious belief or any other kind of social distinction it's possible for humans to make between one group and the other. What we have also come up with is this notion that in order to understand the dynamics of aggression and discrimination, it's really important for us to understand that discrimination, arbitrary set discrimination, tends to be a gendered phenomena. And what we mean by this is that in general, males will display a higher level of xenophobia, outgroup aggression, discrimination, social predation, and social dominance than women will in general, everything else being equal. Secondly, in general, we make the observation or the assumption that outgroup males are the primary targets of arbitrary set discrimination and not outgroup females. And we used to call this assumption and this hypothesis the outgroup male target hypothesis, and now we are calling it the subordinate male target hypothesis. Thirdly, we make the assumption that the motives for discrimination are somewhat different for outgroup males and females. For outgroup discrimination among males towards outgroups, they'll be motivated by some combination of aggression and social dominance orientation, or the desire to subordinate one social group to another social group. And that the motives for this are aggression and social dominance orientation. Among females, we make the assumption that outgroup discrimination among females towards outgroups will be primarily driven by fear, especially fear of sexual coercion and at the hands of outgroup males. The reason why we make this differential prediction for men and women in terms of the degree of oppression they will engage in has to do with the theory within evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology by Bateman and Trivers, called in parental investment theory and sexual selection theory. And basically this argues that the reproductive fitness of men and women will be, what they do to increase reproductive fitness will be slightly different depending upon the gender of the individual. If we look at the y-axis here, right there, this is what we would call the reproductive fitness or biological fitness. And on the x-axis, we have coalitional dominance and aggression. And the assumption is that it's in the reproductive interests of males to engage in coalitional aggression against outgroups more so than it is in the reproductive interest of females. This leads to a couple of hypotheses which we are now going to look at data that test this. The first one is that xenophobia, social predation, and the desire to dominate other groups will be greater among males than among females. And that is depicted by this small inequality here, that dominance orientation among males will be greater than females. This is perhaps the most well-documented and most consistently found finding within this theory of social dominance orientation. One of the last major empirical studies examining this question was done by Lee, Prado, and Johnson, and it was called a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis takes studies, hundreds or thousands of studies, and looks to see the degree to which those studies all come to the same conclusions. And in this meta-analysis, they looked at 101 samples or studies that have been done of this question, using over 28,000 respondents across 16 countries. And what the results showed was that there were, in fact, indeed, higher levels of dominance orientation, the desire to dominate other groups among males than among females. And there were no exceptions to this trend. There was not a single case in which female dominance orientation was higher than male dominance orientation. The second hypothesis we're going to show some evidence for is what we call this outgroup male target hypothesis, which basically argues that a phenomena we call arbitrary set discrimination, which I defined earlier, is going to be higher for males than for females, which is only to say that males will be discriminated against by virtue of their racial, ethnic, language, religious membership to a greater extent than will women in these groups. And this seems to contradict a very popularly believed notion called double jeopardy, which is to say that if you are a female and a member of a minority group or a subordinated group, you will suffer doubly because of that. And this thesis argues that that's just completely false, that arbitrary set discrimination or racial discrimination, as one example, is really something that males suffer more than females. And we'll show you evidence of this. The nature of the evidence for these proposals I'm making, or the nature of the evidence of this first hypothesis can be found in survey evidence, which we don't have time to go through, archival evidence, and experimental evidence, which is the strongest kind of evidence we have in the social sciences. Some examples of the archival evidence can be found in the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system can be thought of as a form of intergroup aggression, because it is the case in all societies without exception that the criminal justice system is disproportionately controlled by members of dominant groups. Any violence performed by the criminal justice system you can think of as a form of intergroup aggression of dominant groups towards subordinate groups. And one of the things that this will lead to is a disproportionate imprisonment of members of subordinate groups by members of dominant groups, and the disproportionate imprisonment of minorities in all societies. And here's some data we've taken from the United States, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, looking at imprisonment rates for females in the United States, for black females in relationship to white females. And what these bars show are that there is an imprisonment rate, an over-imprisonment rate of black females compared to white females of 5. That is to say, black females are imprisoned at 5 times the rate that white females are. This happened in 2000, 2005, and 2006. However, if you compare that to the imprisonment rates of males, you get this phenomena. If we look at 2000, that black males were imprisoned at 8 times the rate that white males were. And this difference in imprisonment for males and females is really consistent over time. The same thing is found if you look at the differential imprisonment rates of whites versus Latinos in the United States. Among females, Latino females are imprisoned at about twice the rate as white females. And that's holds for 2005 and 2006, but the imprisonment rate for Latino males compared to white males is much greater than that. Those are the red bars here. There's evidence of experimental evidence of this hypothesis called the outgroup male target hypothesis by looking at what we call audit studies. And audit studies are studies in which, let's say, minorities and members of dominant groups have the same credentials, have the same educational backgrounds, dress in the same suit of clothes, have the same credit history, and apply for jobs. And what the data shows universally across societies is that dominant groups will be given the job at a higher rate than members of subordinate groups will. And this is an audit study that was conducted in Sweden, which is considered one of the most egalitarian societies on the planet. And what this did was look at the job applicants of native Swedes, white, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed Swedes, compared to Arab immigrants to Sweden. And people who were applying for jobs either had Swedish last names or Arab last names. And what the data showed was, if we look just at women and men, that native Swedes had a callback rate or given jobs at twice the rate as the Arab immigrants. And this was the case for women, Arab immigrants compared to native Swedes and men. So there was about the same level of discrimination. However, when you look at the level of discrimination what they did was, in this study, is say, okay, what would it take to get rid of this discrimination? How to make it even so that a native-born Swede and an immigrant would have the same probability of getting hired for a job. And what they did in this was give the foreign immigrant, the Arab immigrant, 2 years more of relevant job experience compared to the Swedish compatriot. So they had an advantage, and the question was, would that make the probability of being hired about the same? And lo and behold, once you give the immigrant female higher credentials, better credentials, more job-related experience, the level of discrimination against the Arab immigrant goes down. It's not statistically significant. She has about the same chance of getting a job as her Swedish compatriot. But what happened when overly qualified Arab males went to seek a job with everything else being equal under controlled circumstances? In this case, we find that the discrimination against the Arab male did not decrease, but in fact increased. It became much more difficult for the male Arab immigrant to get a job when he was overqualified compared to his Swedish compatriot. Experimental evidence. One piece of experimental evidence we've been working with recently is what we call the prepared fear paradigm. Evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists have argued that there are certain animals in the natural world which we have a strong reason to be afraid of, like poisonous snakes and poisonous spiders. There are other animals which we're not prepared to be naturally afraid of, like ducks and butterflies. The reasoning goes that if we were to associate pictures of poisonous animals with noxious stimuli, electrical shocks and white noise, unpleasant noise generated through earphones, and take one pair of this prepared stimulus, we would find that once the noxious stimulus pairing with the picture of the animal would go away, the fear would linger, even though it was no longer being reinforced. And the reason for that is that we are naturally predisposed to fear certain kinds of animals. And that would not happen with fear for what we call unprepared fear of ducks and butterflies. And so what happened was, one of my colleagues at Harvard, Mahzrin Banaji and her team, decided to apply this to conditioned fear of members of other ethnic groups, out groups, and reasoned that once you could look at members of out groups as being prepared, unprepared. That is to say, there's no reason for us to be afraid of them. If you are a white respondent, you are unprepared to be afraid of another member of your ethnic group. But if you're a white respondent, you are prepared to be afraid of a member of an out group. And they associated one member of this pair with a white noise and electric shock, and did the same thing for pictures of out-group members to see whether or not the fear of these groups would linger, and that was measured by looking at a galvanic skin response. And what the data show is that among those who, among the prepared faces, there was a major effect for fear for both the black face and the white face. But when the stimuli was no longer being associated with white noise and electric shock, the fear of the member of your in-group disappeared entirely. It was no longer statistically significant, but fear of the member of the out-group persisted, even when there was no longer an association between shock and white noise and the picture of the group. We decided that if our hypothesis about this differential of prejudice against males and females is correct, that the finding that the fear of the out-groups would be lingering compared to fear of the in-groups would be lingering, that should only work with male out-group members as targets rather than female out-groups as targets. So we decided to cross this and add in the dimension of the gender of the out-group target. And what we find is for female targets, whether the target be an in-group member or an out-group member, there was no lingering fear after the white noise association was used. And the same was the case for pictures of in-group male targets. But for out-group male targets, there was a lingering fear of that individual, even after there was no longer an association between the picture of the individual and electric shock. There was also experimental evidence looking at gender of both the targets and gender of the participants, or the allocators, in arbitrary set discrimination. And in this experiment, we looked at social allocation as a function of the gender of the respondent and the gender of the target. And this was a setup in which the University of California, because of economic difficulties, had to take away money, had to decrease the economic support of student organizations. And those student organizations could be in-group organizations, out-group organizations, male student organizations, and female student organizations. And we gave the respondents in this experiment the following list of choices. Either they could take away $13,000 from each group, from the in-group or the out-group and the out-group, or, and this would be the rational thing to do, they would only take away $7,000 from your in-group, but only $1,000 from the out-group. And the problem with this is that out-groups earn more money or save more money than in-groups do. But that would still be the economically rational thing to do because everybody is fined less money. Or you have the choice in the extreme opposite direction in which everybody is charged more money, but members of the out-group are charged more money than members of the in-group. And the issue is, what will people do depending upon whether they're in-group or out-group members, male or female groups involved? And for female targets, by both male respondents and female respondents, there was a tendency to charge less money to everybody, regardless of racial group membership. But among male targets, female respondents didn't discriminate. They made rational economic choices. But male respondents, when faced with male student organizations, went in the other direction. They were willing to be charged more in order to have the privilege of charging the out-group members even more than they were. Okay? Hypothesis number 3, and the last one, deals with this differential motive hypothesis. And this basically says that male discrimination against arbitrary sets will be primarily motivated by aggression and dominance orientation, whereas female discrimination against arbitrary sets will be primarily motivated by fear, especially fear of sexual coercion by out-group males. So we set up an experiment to look at this. We looked at explicit racial bias against African Americans on the part of European Americans. And we looked at that as a function of the gender of the participant, the level of aggression of the participant, and the level of dominance orientation of the participant. And what we found was that explicit racial bias here on the y-axis among female participants was in fact a function of the desire to dominate other groups. That is to say, those female participants with high STO scores had high explicit racial bias, and low STO scores had low levels of explicit racial bias, but not much else happened. But that was not what was associated with racial bias among male participants. Here, we found that explicit racial bias against outgroups, in this case African Americans, was a joint function, what we call an interactive function, of both aggression, the level of aggression, the more explicit racial bias, and social dominance orientation. That is to say, as aggression went up, bias against the outgroup males went up especially high. The last study, or the next to the last study, is looking at extinction bias again. What happens when you associate electric shock with pictures of members of in-groups and out-groups as a function of levels of aggression, SDO, the desire to dominate other groups, the gender of the target, and the gender of the participant. These were the variables we examined. And what we found was what we call an interaction effect, or a joint effect in only one case. When we're looking at extinction bias against male targets done by male participants, we find again that If you just look at those who have low levels of dominance orientation, aggression doesn't seem to matter very much at all. But among those male participants looking at male targets, extinction bias increased strongly as a function for high SDO subjects. That is to say, the more aggressive the individual was, and if they had dominance, high dominance orientation, they had high extinction bias, or the phenomena of feeling threatened even when there was no longer an association between pictures and electric shock. Finally, this is the last experiment, and I think the most interesting one. This is an experiment done by one of my colleagues at the UCLA at the time where I was, and it looks at explicit racial bias against African Americans among white American women as a function of where they are in the menstrual cycle. Okay? And what this shows is, as women's likelihood of being impregnated increases, that's the blue curve here, the level of risk of impregnation, so does their bias against African American men. Okay? And that's a pretty strong correlation. And it's even stronger if we look at this as a function of vulnerability to sexual coercion, how afraid the women are of being raped. So that among women who are not particularly afraid of being raped, there was a relatively mild correlation between conception risk and racial bias against African American males. But among those white women who were especially afraid of being raped, there was this very strong relationship between the likelihood of being impregnated and racial bias against the African American male. So I'm going to conclude with the following statements. There's general support for this theory of gender prejudice, and it basically argues that compared to females, males have a tendency to be aggressive against outgroups, predatory, anti-egalitarian, and this is a universal phenomena found in all countries and at all times as far as we can tell. Secondly, there's, consistent with this outgroup male target hypothesis, it's outgroup males rather than outgroup females which tend to be the primary targets of racial or arbitrary set discrimination. Thirdly, we're arguing that the motives for intergroup discrimination appear to be slightly different for men and women, which is to say, among males, discrimination against outgroups is primarily driven by some combination of aggression and the desire to dominate other groups. But among females, discrimination against outgroup males is primarily driven by generalized fear, especially fear of sexual coercion. And at that point, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.